Hi, my name is Ron Furstenau. I'd like to welcome you to the third of our series on the science and religion and their compatibility from First Lutheran Church here in Colorado Springs. To give you a little bit of an idea of what we talked about the first two lessons, on lesson number one, it was sort of an overview of the compatibility and in some cases the non-compatibility of science and religion. And the most important thing I think to remember from those first two lessons is that both science and religion are searching for truth. They simply ask and answer different questions. Science tries to answer the how and why of things, whereas religion tries to answer what it actually means. And you also recall that certainly my view from a scientific perspective is that I look at the Bible as simply another, or I look at nature as another Bible, that is a physical Bible that we can look at every single day and that God has given us the tools to try to understand it. And we talked about evolution a little bit last time, and whether you believe in evolution or not, it really shouldn't have any bearing on your faith. It suffices to say that God is the creator, no matter how we believe he actually did it. Last time we focused on the big things like evolution and mathematics and cosmology. Today we're going to focus on the little things, which are things that really not as many people know about or have an opinion on. But I think it's really important to understand a little bit about this so you can get an idea of the awesomeness of God's creation. It wasn't until it didn't really start to dawn on me, and I've been a professional chemist my whole life, until my 30s, that the truly amazing part of God's creation is in the small things like atoms and molecules, most of which, of course, we can't see. And it really wasn't until I got into my 50s that the wonder of God's creation at the tiny level really hit home. And my hope is that through today's lesson, my hope is that understanding a little bit about this atomic and molecular world will help you to better understand and appreciate God's marvelous design of our universe. I think for me as a chemist, where I see God's creation and amazing work evident the most is in the periodic table of the elements. Much like Darwin's theory of evolution, the periodic table was originally put together in the late 1800s based on experimental data. Although chemists were at that time believing in the concept of atoms and molecules, most other scientists were not. Many scientists in other branches of science, they certainly understood about chemical reactions and so forth, but they didn't really think they needed to understand or appreciate the concept of atoms and molecules. Dmitry Mendeleev, a Russian chemist, is often attributed with developing the first practical periodic table of the elements. It's called periodic table because the elements, he arranged them on the table in terms of periodic patterns, repeatability of patterns. It's these patterns, the same type of concept of patterns that Darwin used to organize his theory of evolution. But the patterns on the periodic table were not physical patterns. Mendeleev saw how each element combined with certain other elements, which, for example, if we look at oxygen, and oxygen is this red one right here, he looked at how many hydrogens it took to combine with the oxygen. So we have H2O right here. Right below oxygen on the periodic table is sulfur. Oxygen itself is a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas, where sulfur in the same column on the periodic table is a white or a yellow solid powder. Yet they both form H2O or H2S. That's the similarities that he saw. And he arranged these elements into what he called the combining power, how many hydrogens they could actually combine with. And this was a very, very successful way of organizing the periodic table, and it allowed him to predict that certain elements existed long before they were actually discovered. But the concept of the periodic table that Mendeleev put forth in the late 1800s, he had no idea why it was the way it was. He understood about the concept of atoms and molecules, but they had no idea of the existence of subatomic particles like electrons, protons, or neutrons. They had to wait until the early 1900s for the discovery of these. But the key part of this periodic table, it allowed scientists and chemists to predict what was going to actually happen before it ever did. If we look at the periodic table of the elements, certainly most of the elements in the universe are the small elements, like hydrogen and helium, as I mentioned last time, are the two predominant elements in our universe. But to me, the most important element with respect to life here on Earth is carbon. And what makes carbon so unique is its ability to combine with up to 4 other things, including itself. No other molecule can actually do that. For example, I have some molecule models here. The black ones that you see are carbons, the white ones are hydrogens, and the red ones are oxygens. And you can see how many different things the carbon can combine with, and all of these along here are combining with 4 different things, and they can string together. This particular molecule is called amyl acetate. It's essentially what it is. It's artificial banana odor. And you can see how we could really make this infinitely long. Not only that, it can double back on itself. This particular molecule right here, you can see we have this ring. This is vanillin, or the flavoring that you have in vanilla. And then it can do even more things. It can kind of move into a ball like this. And this molecule is menthol, or oil of peppermint. So you have an idea of how important carbon is, right? And no other element can do this, but maybe the key thing about carbon is this is the basic atom that you can use to design an infinite variety of molecules, and in living things, certainly carbohydrates, proteins, fats, plastics, and even DNA. Now, it wouldn't be until the 1950s that chemistry could be applied to molecular biology and begin to understand the chemistry of life. But that brings us to the big question on the atomic level, which I don't know the answer to, is, but when does life begin? Because atoms and molecules are not alive. That really brings us to the concept of biochemistry, which is the study of the chemistry of life. I'd like to quote Francis Collins, who is the former director of the National Institutes of Health, NIH. And he says, as a scientist who's also a believer, the chance to uncover the incredible intricacies of God's creation is an occasion for worship. To be able to look for the first time in human history at all 3 billion letters of the human DNA, which I think is as God's language, it gives us just a tiny glimpse into the amazing creative power of his mind, right? It was the 1950s that scientists began to unravel the secrets of DNA. In cells, DNA is a large molecule, much bigger than these molecules that I have up here, that translates translates into proteins, the stuff that we're made out of. These things are maybe up to about 15 or 20 atoms on these ones that I have up here, but DNA, human DNA, has about 6 billion of these. So if these look complex to you, of course, it's nothing compared to what the DNA is. But I think the important thing to remember about DNA, just like these, the structure of these, how these atoms are arranged, is related to their function. And that's very true with DNA, but now we're talking about it on a 6 billion atom scale here. And a simple example of the importance of precise arrangement of atoms and molecules to function, if we take the letters, the 3 letters OCW, OCW in that arrangement really doesn't mean anything to any of us. But if we arrange them as COW, or cow, it does. So just that 3-letter arrangement gives you an idea of how critical the arrangement must be in living systems as well. Sort of the odd thing about living systems is that living cells are constructed and operated by DNA. And new DNA comes from DNA self-replication. But then you have to ask yourself, where did the first DNA molecule come from? In other words, how did the genetic information necessary for the first living cell come about? And if somebody has the answer to that, I would sure like to know. It doesn't seem reasonable to me that something as complicated as DNA could have come about by some random chemical process, molecules bumping into each other. It does seem reasonable, however, that God had a hand in this. Many of us have probably heard about the primordial soup, that is some combination of maybe ammonia and phosphate compounds present in warm water, and then light and heat and electricity causing more complex molecules to form, basically a pond that's a chemistry set, if you will. The conditions on the Earth at that time would have been very different then and very hostile for the chemical formation of these, what we call prebiotic molecules. Could geothermal events in the ocean have provided the conditions? Maybe. Right? Many experiments have been done to try to replicate this prebiotic chemistry set with very limited success. All of these experiments require some degree of human intelligent interaction to get it going, often using complex molecules that could not have existed at the time. And I'd like to take this information from Melissa Cain Travis's book, Science and the Mind of the Maker, what the conversation between faith and science reveals about God. She says, materialist origin of life scenarios, you might recall from the first lesson, materialists are believed that everything's simply matter and the motion of molecules is the reason everything, including our emotions, actually exist. Materialistic origin of life scenarios that seek to account for the first self-replicating molecules fall short of demonstrating that there is a feasible path from dead chemicals to the first information-bearing molecules capable of reproducing and undergoing natural selection. And the conditions on early Earth certainly would not have been feasible for these molecules to form. Biochemists have had some limited success in synthesizing these building blocks at the test tube level, but they've had to incorporate enzymes, molecules that couldn't exist during the early formations in Earth's history. These would not have been present. And she points out that even if these self-synthesizing molecules can be made, clearly intelligent people will be needed to make it happen. Right? To date, the origin of life researchers have learned that many independent variables must align precisely to make any feasible pathway to a self-replicating molecule to make it possible, having exactly the right environment at every stage of chemical evolution, as well as all the building blocks at the right concentrations. But even if a self-replicating molecule can be synthesized, a self-replicating molecule is a very long way from an actual living cell. Right? Because what is life, or what is a living cell? Well, biologists would define it as any organism as an entity that can absorb nutrients from its surroundings and take those nutrients into energy necessary for growth and reproduction. Even the simplest single-cell life forms require a very highly complex information processing to do that. It simply doesn't seem reasonable to me that life could have originated from lifeless molecules without God's intervention. Now, I'd like to take a step backwards in terms of the size of things and touch you a little bit about quantum mechanics and uncertainty. When you look at the world of the atom, it is a very strange place indeed. But when you look at it, you have to marvel at God's ingenuity. Let's go back for a second to the periodic table. Why is it shaped the way it is? Well, quantum mechanics as a theory explains that. It's a very complicated mathematical model that explains things on a very, very tiny level. The term quantum mechanics is thrown around a lot, but I think the first term that you have to understand that is what we refer to as classical mechanics. And all that means is using Newton's laws of motion to predict things, like the motion of cars and spacecraft and planets, big things. But it turns out that using Newton's laws of motion don't work on small things. Atoms, subatomic particles like electrons, and that sort of thing. It just doesn't work. But quantum mechanics does. It predicts the behavior of really, really small things. It's a mathematical theory that is really hard to understand from a physical standpoint, but it predicts the behavior of these small things very well. It doesn't mean it's correct, but it matches experiments. And why do I think that some understanding of this quantum world should be part of a discussion on science and religion? To me, the quantum world is one of the truly convincing pieces of evidence for the existence of God. The ability of humans to understand this tiny world through mathematics simply could not have occurred by accident. For atoms and molecules, which is the chemistry part of quantum mechanics, the simple result of quantum mechanics is this: that the energy of atoms and molecules is quantized. The energy of atoms and molecules is quantized. This is really amazing. We don't know why this is, but we simply know that it is. It's a reason for a lot of scientific instrumentation that tells us things about atoms and molecules. It's why magnetic resonance imaging or an MRI works. It's all about this energy being quantized. And let me show you what I mean by that. On this podium that I'm speaking from, we have a sloping podium toward me. And we can put my pen just about anywhere I want on this, to any degree that I want on this slope. But that's not the way quantum mechanics works or the structure of atoms and molecules. It's more like my pen on this tabletop right here. The pen can be sitting on this table, or I can let go of it, and it can be on the floor. This is one step. The floor is another step, right? If I try to set it in between, it's just going to fall down. It can set here, it can set on the floor. We say that the potential place where I can put the pen is quantized. It can only be at certain levels. And the energy of atoms and molecules are like that as well. Now, what experiments led to this dramatic conclusion about small things? Well, I have here probably the scientific instrument that most allowed us to do that, and this is a simplified form of it. It's a spectroscope. And what a spectroscope is, it's basically a light separator. You have inside of it a prism, or what's called a diffraction grating, and it separates light. And scientists in the mid-1800s invented this, and they would look at the flames and excited gases of a variety of different elements. And what they observed were these straight lines coming down. If you look at a prism through the light from the sun, you see a rainbow of different colors. But if you look at particular elements, pure elements off the periodic table, you see a series of bright lines. Nobody could explain these bright lines, but what they did observe at the time in the 1800s is that every element on the periodic table had a unique set of lines. And we know now that the reason that they did is that they all had different numbers of electrons, which gave rise to these different numbers of lines. Each element had a unique pattern. It was in 1913 that Danish physicist Niels Bohr made up something that explained these lines, and that you could see at the spectroscope. And it proved to be correct. He said that the electrons in atoms can only have certain energy levels. That is, it was quantized. So he said that what you observe in the spectroscope, when you zap it with a flame or electricity, it boosts the electrons up to a higher energy level. And then when they come back down to a lower energy level, they always come back to the same levels, which release a certain amount of light, a very thin amount of light in the spectrum. And it turns out that he was correct, but his model was pretty simple, and it only worked for hydrogen, a one electron system. But in the 1920s, scientists began to postulate that for very small particles like electrons, they can behave as waves, right? Which is a really hard concept to understand. But it was proven experimentally, right? Erwin Schrödinger, from that concept of electrons behaving as waves, developed a mathematical theory for the structure of atoms, basically saying that we can treat the electrons as waves. This is really difficult to imagine from a physical sense, but it worked, right? And one of the strange things about it is that you really can't think of the electron being in a specific point in space. We can only talk about the probability of it being somewhere. I'd like to talk about a couple of the strange concepts of quantum mechanics. And first of all is this thing that we call the wave function. That is the mathematical expression we use to describe an electron. And it turns out that this mathematical function tells us everything that we need to know about the particle, like an electron in the atom. It gives us information about what we observe experimentally. And as I mentioned before, this wave function is related to the probability of a particle being somewhere. We can't know with absolute certainty the position of very small objects like electrons and atoms. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is related to this. He said that certain complementary measurements like position and momentum cannot be known exactly and simultaneously in quantum mechanics. On big objects like a car, we can predict, if we know its velocity and so forth, we can predict exactly where it's going to be at a particular time. But for little objects, it doesn't work like that. Basically, all we can say about the location of an electron in an atom is that it's somewhere in the atom. The other thing that I want to mention that comes up sometimes is what we call the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. It says that the act of measuring something plays an important role in the outcome of an experiment. And what I have to illustrate this here, we're going to think of this box as essentially being a confinement for a small particle like an electron moving. And in this particular case, the small particle is just this wadded up piece of paper. If I put this particle in here, and we know that it's somewhere in the box no matter how I move this, that location and the existence of this particle can be described by something that's called a wave function. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these separators in there. Now, with these separators in there, what I have done is I have split the wave function in half. That is, 50% is in one side of the box, 50% is in the other side of the box. Now, I'm going to move the two halves apart. All right. Still, half of the wave function is one box, half is in the other. But now, I'm going to observe to see where that particle actually is. Right? It's in this one, which means it's not in this one. Here, all of a sudden, when I make the observation that the particle is in there, now all of the wave function is in this box and none of it is in here. It's not until we make the observation that it affects what the outcome of this wave function actually is. And that's one of the harder things to understand, right? Now, several of the authors that I've read in preparing the reading list for this often like to invoke quantum mechanics or quantum physics in their arguments. And let me read one of the quotes that somebody says. They say that the quantum wave function is a fundamental blueprint of God's creative plan. Someone else says that quantum physics, as we know it today, has nothing to say about God directly. However, it has a great deal to say about the nature of reality and consciousness. Although these statements that I just read may be true, you should be very careful about accepting statements like those. Quantum physics and quantum mechanics is often used as an answer to every perplexing problem in society by people who really don't have a firm grasp of the concepts, as if anybody did. I think it's used so much because it sounds mysterious and incomprehensible to the average person. Be skeptical of this. It's much like cryptocurrency is for me. No one has ever been able to explain cryptocurrency or why it's worth anything to me in any manner that makes sense. So I'm very skeptical about its legitimacy. Again, you should use that same skepticism when people quote quantum mechanics about things. What does any of this have to do with religion? Well, understanding quantum mechanics likely has nothing to do with theology. However, I do believe that quantum mechanics is one of the fundamental things about nature that God wants us to understand. God has enabled humans to understand mathematics. How amazing is it that human intellect came up with quantum mechanics? But only God could have come up with this amazing world of very small things and given humans the ability to understand it. It's this world of very small things that's truly a display of the awesomeness of God's creative power. The last thing that I'd like to touch on is something that we really can't even touch, and that's consciousness. And the concept of consciousness is definitely something that has not been explained scientifically. In Melissa Cain Travis's book, Science and the Mind of the Maker, the traditional Christian view, that is substance dualism, is that human beings are immaterial souls integrated with a physical body. And this stands in contrast to the scientism or physicalist or materialist view that says human beings are nothing more than the matter that we're made out of. Neuroscientific data cannot rule out the existence of a soul, but it can't confirm it as well. If all we believe is immaterialism, that we're just a concept of the parts, the material parts that we're made out of, it would then make sense that we probably shouldn't have any free will to do anything at all, that everything is predetermined by the motion of the atoms and molecules. And of course, common sense tells us that that cannot possibly be true, right? I believe that the consciousness and existence of a soul is the thing that really gives us free will. I'd like to read a couple of things that other people have said about the concept of consciousness. Thomas Reid was a 1700s philosopher, and he defines the body to be that which is solid, movable, and divisible. The mind or the soul is the part that thinks. And he always said that only free minds can write poetry and do science. Contemporary philosopher Roger Trigg makes the point that if everything, including the brain, is entirely the result of law-governed material processes, no room is left for the exercise of reason. One of my favorites is by Blaise Pascal, a famous mathematician in the 1600s, who asserted, and I quote, "How can matter have conscious experiences and contemplate abstract ideas? There must be an immaterial soul freely exerting control over the brain." And then finally, modern theologian and philosopher J.P. Moreland, in the book Science and Secularism, points out the same thing that Pascal did in the 1600s and likely countless others, that consciousness is completely unexplainable by scientism. How can mere matter originate consciousness? How could it have come about from lifeless atoms and molecules? When you start removing lifeless atoms from the brain, when does consciousness go away? And then finally, philosopher Angus Mengwe has argued that if we want to account for consciousness, mental causation and reasoning, we need some entity over and above the body. This entity must be simple, have thoughts, and as separable parts, persist as a unity over time, and have active power. That sounds like a soul. In short, the belief in the soul, the traditional Christian view of substance dualism, that human beings are immaterial souls integrated with a physical body, is what really separates us from the rest of God's creation. I hope you've enjoyed this 3-lesson series on science and religion. And I hope this has gotten you into a little bit more about what we all believe in the scientific world and how this integrates really complementary with the existence of God.